Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Uh, My name is Beshara Doumani. I'm Director of Middle East Studies here at Brown University, and this is our 6th or 7th semi-annual critical conversation. The topic today is, of course, the Middle East and the U.S. elections, Clinton, Trump, and the Middle East. And we have a distinguished speaker with us, and a number of faculty from Brown University. That is our usual format. Think of critical conversation as anti-CNN. So we don't bring in surrogates for this and that side, and then they fight it out. We question the sides themselves. And so what we're looking for here is an in-depth discussion of some of the issues relating to the U.S. elections and the Middle East. I should tell you that we have some people from the overflow room. We're trying to bring them down because I think we can have more people here. There's some seats in the front. Maybe you can come and take one. And this event is live streamed. So, and some pictures will be taken. So I want to say hello to the audience out there. We have a tradition in Middle East Studies. We don't do introductions. So it's save time for everything else. You can find the bios of the speakers, plus their talks, on the sheets in front of you. You can take a look at that. And for those of you watching online, you'll find it on the website. But for those who might see it on YouTube a little later, which is usually our biggest audience, then I might say just a couple of quick words. I think we need to begin with, does the Middle East actually matter to the race for president of the United States? In many ways, foreign policy issues were never decisive in such races. And in this particular case, there doesn't seem to be any big fight about the Middle East itself. Now, it is true that one of the big issues that have come up is the question of massive U.S. military intervention in this region, which began really in 1978 and peaked during the first Gulf War when 500,000 U.S. soldiers went to the Middle East. And there's been several wars since, in Iraq, of course, and the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So there is some difference of opinion on whether the United States should have been involved to that extent between the two candidates. But other than that, it's really indirect stuff. In many ways, what our speakers will address is why the Middle East should matter. And what are some of the fundamental issues that any future president will have to deal with? In the case of the Middle East in relationship to the rest of the world, of course, in many ways we could think of it as the canary in the mine for a lot of the issues facing the world today, especially on questions of climate change, on energy regimes and systems, on the question of non-state actors and terrorism, on the question of the future of the nation state as a political configuration, and so on and so forth. This is not to mention the way it is part of our everyday life here, such as Islamophobia and the question of immigration and so on. So in all of these respects, the Middle East does matter a great deal. And what we have with us today, our special guest of honor is Rami Khouri, whose talk is titled, "Has the United States Learned Anything from its 15-year-old nonstop wars in the Middle East?" Rami Khouri is an internationally syndicated political columnist and author, and adjunct professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut. He was the first director and is now a senior fellow at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. He's been a non-resident senior fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard for the past decade, and is a former editor of the Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper and Jordan Times newspaper in Amman, and many, many other things, including being awarded for the Pax Christi International Peace Prize in 2006. Our next speaker, and I'll introduce them all now, is Jeffrey Colgan. Jeff will be speaking on comparing the candidates especially on 4 issues: their strategies, their track records, the nuclear question, and of course oil and energy, which is his specialty. He's a Richard Holbrook Associate Professor of Political Science at the Watson Institute, and previously he was on the faculty of American University in Washington, D.C., and a residential fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and his most recent book is Petroaggression: When Oil Causes War, from Cambridge University Press. Next, we'll have Narges Bajoghli, speaking on the next president's Iran problem. Narges is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Watson Institute, and she's an anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker with expertise in Iran, specifically on media production in the country and on the Revolutionary Guards and the paramilitary Basij organization. In addition to her academic writing, Narges has also written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Washington Post, Middle East Research Information Project, MERIP, one of my favorite publications. You should all subscribe, The Huffington Post, and so on. She's also appeared as a guest commentator on Iranian politics on Democracy Now!, NPR, BBC, and so on. And our last speaker, but not least, will be Stephen Kinzer, speaking on, his talk is comparing the candidates on Israel, Palestine, Syria, ISIS, and Libya. And Stephen Kinzer is a senior fellow in international public affairs at the Watson Institute, an award-winning foreign correspondent, spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times, and has written many, many books on Central America, on Rwanda, on Turkey and Iran, and so on, that trace the history of American foreign policy. And he writes a world affairs column for the Boston Globe. I read it religiously. I highly recommend it. The format is simple. Our guest of honor speaks for about 20 minutes. That's our usual format. Then there'll be replies from Brown faculty within the 7 to 10 minute range. And that should leave us more than an hour for discussion. And we will be having discussion through the internet, on Twitter, and also in this room. I'm so happy to see such a wide range of people here for this event. It's important, and now I ask Rami Khouri to begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Beshara. Thank you all for coming out here, and thanks to the Middle East Studies Department, the Watson Institute, Brown University, and anybody else who's been involved in organizing this for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored particularly to be with this group of panelists, so, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't, but I am very humbled and pleased to be with them, and I'm sure this will be a good learning experience for all of us. So in my 20 minutes, I'm going to quickly make some comments about has the U.S. learned anything in the last 15 years of nonstop warfare in the Middle East, meaning from the start of the global war on terror after the 9/11 attacks? The simple answer is no. I don't think it has learned anything, and in fact, I think it has made things much worse for the region. But I'll explain that, but let me first say that presidential transitions in the United States, in the eyes of people in the Middle East, in the last about 40 years or so, since Nixon maybe, have made very little difference, I believe. With only occasional shifts in positions taken by presidents on issues like the Arab-Israeli conflict, the oil producers, Iran, or other issues, there has essentially been a continuation of American policy in most of the Middle East for the last maybe 40 or 50 years. But in particular, I want to emphasize that the time frame that we need to analyze, that we need to use to analyze American policy in the Middle East is really, in my view, the last 35 years, because it was really in the early 1980s when the United States started to be actively involved, directly or indirectly, in military warfare in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, starting with the support of the Mujahideen, as they were called, the guerrillas who were fighting against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the early 80s. And since then, the United States has been fighting continuously, militarily, directly or indirectly, all across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And I think that's the overriding reality, the consistent policy strand that has shaped American attitudes to events in the region, that you need to use your overwhelming military power and capabilities to try to address issues, whether it's fighting terrorism, supporting your allies, dealing with collapsed states or whatever it may be, protecting oil, that the emphasis on military active action by the United States in the Middle East, I think has been clear and I think has been a big failure. And why has it been a big failure? Because I think there are 6 main goals that the U.S. broadly has set out in terms of fighting the global war on terror and broader campaigns in the region. One is to protect the United States against another 9/11 attack. The second is to destroy terrorist sanctuaries. The third is to break up Al-Qaeda or other groups like it, like ISIS, that has since come along. The fourth is to try to counter the violent extremist tendencies that are cropping up all over the region and other places as well, but mostly coming out of the Middle East and South Asia. The fifth is to strengthen allies and protect their allies. And the sixth, I would say, is to try to maintain the integrity of the nation states in that region and to prevent the further collapse of countries. So of those 6 broad aims, basically only one has been achieved, which is to prevent another major attack against the United States like 9/11. And that was achieved because it used elements other than just military attack. It used police action, it used judicial action, it used financial action, it used cooperation with allies. It used all kinds of instruments that are available to a country. And it has largely succeeded. There have been some attacks in the U.S., but they're relatively minor. So what does this tell us in terms of what the next president in the United States will confront and what he or she should do? I think the first thing that has to happen is there needs to be an honest, integrated, complete assessment of the efficacy of American foreign policy in the Middle East and South Asia and in the last 35 years, and whether this consistent emphasis on militarism is actually a useful policy to continue. Now, along with the militarism, you have, for instance, sanctions and threats and the other dimensions of an aggressive military-based policy that is telling the people out there, either we're going to attack you or we're going to threaten to attack you unless you do what we want you to do. So there needs to be a significant assessment of that, but that is something that there is no sign right now of this happening. Neither of the major political parties expresses any interest in doing this, and there seems to be no serious demand in public opinion in the United States to do this either. So it's probably not going to happen, but I think it's important for us to point out why this is important. Now, it's fair to say that some of the military action that the United States has taken over the years could be justified. For instance, the attack against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan could be justified because there was an act of war against the United States and the U.S. has the right to defend itself. You could justify the American-led action to liberate Kuwait from Iraq, which in 1991. So you could justify some of the things that the United States has done, but the overwhelming majority, I think, have not been very successful. Just a couple of facts, statistics. A report published by the Council on Foreign Relations last week showed that there was, in the last year and year and 9 months, since January 2015, that the United States has dropped 23,144 bombs. 23,144 bombs the U.S. has dropped on 6 countries in this last year and 9 months. Most of them, 22,000, were in Iraq and Syria, some in Afghanistan, and then scattered in other countries. This is the 16th year the United States has been at war in Afghanistan. 16th consecutive years, the longest American war, active American war in history, I believe. And what's happening today is that the Taliban are once again resurgent and taking over more and more territory. And this was NATO being involved in Afghanistan along with the U.S. But when you have the situation that you have today in Afghanistan with huge security problems and the Taliban resurgent again, that clearly this is an absolute failure. And anybody who sits in Washington who can't admit this is not worthy of being a public servant. Is in fact involved probably in not just ineffective political leadership, but perhaps criminal activity that should be subjected to international review by perhaps the International Criminal Court or somebody else of that nature. We've had 4 consecutive American presidents now who have bombed Iraq. The last 4 American presidents have nonstop bombed Iraq. And the recent study published by Brown University, in fact, with Kathy Lutz here and Anita Crawford at BU and other professors leading this process, has calculated that the total cost of the global war on terror since 2001 is around 4.8 trillion, that's trillion with a T, 4.8 trillion dollars. And what do we have to show for it? Al-Qaeda is expanding all over the world. The Taliban are resurgent. 6 countries have shown signs of falling apart in the Arab world. Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and others, Somalia, and Yemen. And the birth of ISIS has come about in the last, actually it's been going on for the last 10 years, but in the last 2-3 years they've come into their strongest point, and they're now being pushed back, but the growth of ISIS is one of the things that has happened. There hasn't been a single mechanism by which Arab countries other than Tunisia have been able to transform into pluralistic constitutional democracies. The United States, all of Europe, Russia, the whole world essentially has supported autocratic, non-participatory, non-accountable Arab regimes, continue to pursue these same policies, along with the militarism, this extensive, strong support for military regimes, including now heavily supporting President Sisi in Egypt, who has about 40,000 civil society activists in jail, none of whom have carried out any acts of a criminal nature other than expressing ideas that are opposed to what the government believes in Egypt. So you've got these terrible trends all over the region, huge environmental stresses, the fragmentation of societies along sectarian lines, collapsing central government authorities in many countries, active civil wars in 3 or 4 countries, and of course the latest thing is the Russians coming into Syria and expanding their foothold, which has always been there, but they've now expanded it, while the U.S., in terms of its public opinion relationships in the Arab world, is probably at a low point of the last 40 or 50 years, where the overwhelming majority of people around the Arab world are critical of what the United States is doing, because it's essentially been involved in warfare and has been supporting autocratic, sometimes police state governments that deprive Arab people of their basic rights. So when you look at these, and these are just sort of quick main points that I make about a much wider range of problems all across the Arab world now that have happened while the United States, as well as other people, have pursued these policies. It's important to point out here that that the problems of the Middle East, the terrorism, the refugees, the warfare, the state collapse, the environmental stress, the lack of democracy, lack of human rights, etc., all the problems are not only due to what the United States does. The problems are due to a combination of autocratic Arab regimes, strongly supported by the United States and also by the Russians and the Soviets before them, and now by the Saudis. The Saudis are pouring billions of dollars to keep Sisi in place in Egypt and other non-democratic Arab regimes. So it's not only the United States' problem, and it's not only due to American policies that we have this mess, this dangerous situation in the Arab world, but it is only the United States that has combined in the last 35 years nonstop military warfare, nonstop intense support for Arab autocratic regimes that deny their people their basic rights and that allow corruption and mismanagement and lack of development to persist. And it's only the United States that has consistently, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, sided with Israel to the point where Israel can do anything it wants, and the United States rewards it, as it just did with $38 billion in aid. And the next day, the Israelis announced an expansion of settlements, thumbing their nose at not just at Obama, but thumbing their nose at the American presidency and the American system of government. And it's only the U.S. that combines these different factors in its foreign policy, and therefore it deserves special criticism. And we're talking about now what the next president should do. The next president should be aware of this legacy and perhaps think about how it might be changed. Is there a way to change it? And there is urgent need to change it because the trends in the Middle East, I mentioned some of the big problems, are only getting worse. And I'll mention just one or two points. Beshara, you'll tell me when I have 2 minutes?
No, a little bit more.
Okay. Just give me the 2-minute signal.
Okay.
So why is there an urgent need to change the trajectory of broad developments in the Arab world, which is what I know best? Others will talk about Iran and Turkey and Israel. But because the underlying drivers of all of these deteriorating conditions in the Arab region have been completely untouched by the Arab leaderships and by the Western powers, as well as the other powers, Iran, Russia, Europe, all the other people who support autocratic regimes. None of them have touched any of the underlying real driving forces for the destruction, for the turbulence, for the state collapse, and all the negative things we have, including terrorism and ISIS and refugees and sectarian violence and all of these things. And what are these underlying drivers? Well, they're actually almost every aspect of life in the region. If you take away those small pockets of wealthy, well-managed societies like, say, Dubai or Doha in Qatar or a few other little places that really live in a kind of bubble because they're very wealthy, they're very small, they're very well protected, they're not subjected to the same forces. But there's 400 million people in the Arab world. About probably 200 million of them live in really stressful situations where they're really not sure if they're going to be able to feed their kids next month or have enough money to buy water or to get heating oil or to deal with basic family essentials. The stress on fundamental basic human needs on families all across the Arab region, I'm talking about the Arab world here, not the rest of the region, the stresses have increased to a very significant point. And you can see some of the drivers for this. One, about 45% of primary and secondary school students in Arab schools are not learning anything. Almost half of the students in primary and secondary schools are not learning anything, and they can't read and write, and they can't do basic math. This is based on international testing standards. They're going to drop out of school, and many of them have. Another figure is that about maybe 40–50% of most of the labor forces in the Arab world are informal labor. They don't have a contract, they don't have minimum wage, they don't have health insurance, they don't have pension, they don't have protection systems. And most of these people who can't learn anything in school because the quality of school has become so bad, are going to join this mass of informal laborers who are vulnerable, poor, marginalized, and are only going to be a source of trouble. About 20 to 25 million, we don't know the exact figure, between 20 and 25 million young Arab boys and girls are not in school who should be in school. So we're talking here about maybe 60, 70 million Arab young people are either out of school or are in school and learning nothing and are going to join this big mass of informal labor and who simply cannot have their basic human needs met, let alone their political rights or their dignity. That's one reason you had these mass uprisings in 2011 all across the region. Every one of these underlying drivers of discontent and fear and disenchantment and vulnerability has been exacerbated in the last 15 years because of the nature of foreign policy interventions by the US and other powers, because of the impact of the Arab-Israeli conflict, continuously with Israeli settlements and humiliation of Arab countries, because of the impact of the support of some of the wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia for the autocratic regimes, and now the Russians and the Iranians are both in there supporting their friends and fighting militarily. Northern Syria is a free fire zone for anybody in the world who wants to go and try out their weapons. The Russians, the Turks, the Kurds, the Syrian, Iraqi, Hezbollah, Iran, Saudi Arabia, everybody's there. The Americans, they're all there fighting. So all of these trends have been going on now for 15 years, but really they've been going on for 35 years. And this needs a responsible person in leadership in the United States to sit down and say, well, we can't just continue this. It's stupid to continue this kind of policy. And therefore, I think a serious reassessment is called for. Whether it happens or not is really up to you, the American people, in a democracy that is based on the principle of the consent of the governed. History has suggested that the consent of the governed is actually inoperative when it comes to American policy in the Middle East, but it's operative in other places. But that's your decision, and I hope you will make the right decision. Thank you.
Well, first, let me thank the Center for Middle East Studies for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be on the panel with my colleagues. I want to start by putting my cards on the table, or maybe it's getting a few things off my chest. You can decide. I'll say first, U.S. policies toward the Middle East over the last 2 decades have been pretty awful, as Rami describes so eloquently. Clinton represents a continuation of Obama's efforts to keep a lid on the mess created in part by previous U.S. administrations, in part by his own administration. And that strategy has its flaws, but at least Clinton is a gifted diplomat and a steady hand. Trump is the opposite. He has no strategy, or at least he has every strategy. Right? His strategy ranges from we need Muslim allies and we need to be friends with Muslim countries to let's turn them into glass. And if you walk through what he said on the Middle East with any kind of care, the sheer volume of incoherence starts to get to you. He says he's not worried about Saudi Arabia or other countries acquiring nuclear weapons. But he also says that he's going to ease tensions and bring stability to the region. He is intentionally unpredictable about his nuclear policies because he claims he's going to be better at this than any previous president. At the same time, he demonstrates ignorance about the basics of nuclear command. But the scary part of that is not that the strategy is the worst part. It's much more that the temperament of the man who would execute it. As a candidate, Trump has proven, in my view, to be reckless, ignorant of policy, thin-skinned, and offensive. Offensive to Muslims and to non-Muslims. And that's not the kind of person I want as Commander-in-Chief. So I put my cards on the table pretty clearly. I think it's worth talking about 3 additional points when we compare these candidates. A second point a first additional point, I guess, is about the track record of each candidate and what they've learned over the last 20 years. Both candidates favored the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Only one of them has owned up to it. Trump continues to outright lie about his position in 2003, which was in favor of Iraq. And I think that speaks very clearly to what kind of accountability we can expect. A second point is about nuclear proliferation. One of Obama's major accomplishments was the U.S.-Iran agreement on nuclear proliferation. I gather we're going to talk about that more later on. Trump says that he could have achieved a better deal, but he offers absolutely no specifics about how that could be done. And in general, he insists his approach to Iran would be better than Obama's, but he says nothing about how or why or in what way. And then a third consideration, I think, is on oil and energy politics, which is my research specialty. And Trump has an energy plan of sorts that will supposedly vastly increase fossil fuel production in this country and by implication decrease U.S. dependence on the Middle East. Again, he offers no specifics about this plan. Instead, he blames the federal government for supposedly over-regulating the coal and natural gas industry. And the real reason for the decline in the coal industry, in my view, has everything to do with the market. Right? The chief competitor to coal is natural gas, and the price for natural gas has gotten a lot lower in the last decade. And the coal industry is suffering the consequences. That's economics. That has very little to do with the government. And if anything, I think the government has been too lenient on the industry as a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. But that's a whole other story. I would just say that the Trump is actually not really interested in the facts about coal or natural gas or even the oil industry globally. He is pandering to what people want to hear. I could probably go on in this vein, but I will get off my soapbox on this particular way. And I want to reflect on a broader issue about how we as citizens and how policy experts should be thinking about this election. I think it's fair to say that Trump's candidacy is fueled in part by a loss of trust in experts, in expertise, in authority, maybe even in universities as well. And Clinton's team is drawn from the very same foreign policy elite behind the U.S. policies over the last 20 years that Rami's been describing. And that's bad. And it's not surprising that some people think that it's time for a change. The issue is that people start to ask themselves, well, you know, it's been so bad, could it really get any worse? Right? Almost a rhetorical question. Could it really get any worse with President Trump? And I think that to think that the answer to that question is no, is to be deeply optimistic, profoundly optimistic, right? That Trump couldn't make it worse. In fact, I think he could do a lot of damage in his time. But after the election, whoever wins, one of the problems our country faces is the accountability gap in Washington. Most of the people in the foreign policy establishment that got us into the Iraq war fiasco are still in Washington, still employed, still offering policy advice. And most of the people that in economic policy circles that led us into the financial crisis of 2008 are still in Washington, are still employed by government or think tanks or lobby firms, and they're still shaping policy. So after November 8th, the policy elites in Washington do need to have, I think, a hard look in the mirror. We have to change the narrative about the kind of expertise it requires to be president and the kind of accountability that goes along with advising the president. and for shaping policy more broadly. I don't like the prospect of a President Trump, but I also don't like the prospect of a Clinton victory that simply resets the status quo and makes only marginal changes. That is a recipe for a presidential election in 2020 that makes 2016 look like a warm-up lap. So here's the even deeper message. Nobody, in my experience at least, has a hard look in the mirror unless they have a strong reason to do so. It's not comfortable. Right? So it's not just the policy elites in Washington that need to be thinking about changes. That falls on us, on university professors, on concerned citizens, on students, to demand changes. And it could be institutional changes, reforming the election system, the gerrymandering in Congress, and what have you. That could be it. But it also should be a deeper demand for effective governance. If you're a congressman and go to Washington simply to shut down the government with no plan to make the government actually run better or to make better policy, if you're just an obstructionist, then you have no business in office. And as voters, I think we need to demand better from our representatives. And the hard part is we need to demand better from our representatives even if they're not in our district. That's the challenge that we face. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Okay, just lean over a little. Doesn't go very far. Well, thank you so much to the Middle East Center for inviting me on this panel. I'm very honored to be here. So as Professor Beshara Doumani explained, I'm going to be speaking about the next president's Iran problem. The U.S.-Iran relations since the 1979 revolution have been very strained, as we all know. And President Obama's effort at bringing together the Iran deal was significant for many reasons. One more than any being that it was the first time that high-level politicians and high-level diplomats from both countries sat down to begin to have a conversation about their shared interest in the Middle East, but especially on the Iran deal. Now, what the Iran deal did was to provide certain avenues in which the United States and the international community, especially the EU, could monitor Iran's nuclear program. But really, the significant part of it was that it allowed an avenue of conversation, especially among Iran and the United States, as well as Iran and the European Union. So the significance of the Iran deal can't be overlooked. However, what has happened since the signing of the Iran deal, since last July, has been that there is a lot of congressional animosity towards this deal and a lot of attempts to do away with this deal. What that's meant is that the United States Department of Treasury and OFAC have been very reluctant to deal with certain sanctions and sanctions relief that are actually implemented in the deal that should be brought about. And more than anything, it's caused deep frustration for the Iranian side. So for both President Obama's administration as well as President Rouhani's administration in Iran, this was a political gamble. To convince their constituencies, to convince their citizens that we need to be able to do this deal and to sit down and talk to each other after 36 years of animosity was a big gamble on both of the president's sides. And they took that gamble with the hope that it would come to something. It did come in July of last year. However, there have been obstructionist forces on both sides, in Iran and in the United States. Arguably, the forces in the U.S. have been much more forceful and have been able to stop a lot of, or at least put obstacles in the front of this nuclear deal being able to be effective. So what that's meant is that there's increased frustration in Iran. among the citizenry because there's been very little that they have seen that the Iran deal has actually impacted their lives in a positive way. The sanctions relief has been far too little, and now there is for the first time, I mean, sort of in some ways in contrast to what Rami was saying about Arab populations, deep sort of public opinion being very low about the United States. Iran's citizens consistently, their public opinion has been very high about the United States. But for the first time this year, we're beginning to see that those numbers drop. And this is significant because since the Islamic Republic has been an enemy of the United States, the people, Iran's population is nearly 80 million at this point. 75% are under the age of 35. It's a very, very young population. The population of the Middle East as a whole tends to be very young. But Iran's population, for the most part, has been very pro-US. In contrast to its government. So its government is anti-US, but public opinion across the population has been very sort of opposite in that. But for the first time since last year, you're beginning to see a drop in those numbers. And that is in big parts due to the fact that the Iran deal has not produced the results that were promised, and that the U.S. Congress especially is working very hard against this deal. So what this means is that even though we have an election here in November, the Iranian presidential election is in June of 2017. There is a chance that President Rouhani and the moderate forces in the Islamic Republic could not win. And somebody like Ahmadinejad has said that he may run again. He's sort of playing the field, even though the Supreme Leader just came out and said that he strongly suggests that he does not run, although Ahmadinejad in the last term of his presidency did not particularly care very much what the Supreme Leader said. And so it's not obvious whether he will or not, but whether he does or not is sort of not the point. The point is that there may be other forces in Iran who can actually take advantage of this increased frustration for the fact that the Rouhani administration is the first administration in 35 years to sit down at the table with the United States. Things have gone wrong and they've gone poorly, and that does not bode well for the next Iranian elections, which is in June. But to get back to the way in which the Iran deal plays out in this election, and the debate between Trump and Clinton last week, Trump said to Clinton, quote, "But you look at the Middle East, you started the Iran deal." He's talking to Clinton. "That's another beauty where you have a country that was ready to fall. I mean, they were doing so badly. They were choking on the sanctions. And now they're going to be actually probably a major power at some point pretty soon, the way they're going." Trump wants to do away with the Iran deal. He said over and over again, the first day he's in office, he's going to rip that document apart. Obviously, he's not sort of looked at very favorably within Iran itself, but then also there is a danger to him when he talks about the Iran deal, and I'll get to that in a second because of the shared interest that I believe that Iran and the United States have. Clinton, on the other hand, though, even though I share my colleague's point of view that I think she would be a much better president given the choices that we have. However, she is known for having hawkish stances towards the Middle East, and she was the one who, in many ways, is sort of credited with being the architect of the harsh sanctions regime against Iran in the first term of President Obama's administration. And she responded to Trump in the debate by saying, quote, "I voted for every sanction against Iran when I was in the Senate, but it wasn't enough. So I spent a year and a half putting together a coalition that included Russia and China to impose the toughest sanctions on Iran." Her line is that the sanctions regime that she was behind creating sort of hit the Iranian regime in the knees and brought them to the table to negotiate. You can argue either way on that, but But what is true about Secretary Clinton is that her team was also in charge of crucial backdoor channel conversations with Iran prior to Secretary Kerry coming in and being able to take the Iran deal and any Iran negotiations into a more public way. So she also has the experience of not only the sanctions, but also working in order to be able to sort of work more diplomatically with Iran. She also is very interested in continuing Obama's legacy, as she says over and over again. And this has been sort of one of the crucial points for Obama's foreign policy legacy. And there is an argument to be made that she will continue that. And people who were close to her in the State Department, such as Jack Sullivan, have said in so many words that they would sort of follow this. But regardless of the outcome, regardless of who is the president come November 9th, what I think is very important for all of us to understand is that the Iran and the U.S. have shared interest in the Middle East today. And the Iran deal has allowed them to cooperate on some levels on these shared interests. And those shared interests are ISIS, containing ISIS and doing away with it, and stabilizing Iraq and Afghanistan. Those are shared interests between the two countries. And they have the potential to be to sort of move in the direction of becoming friendlier with one another, because of the fact that Iran's human capital is such that it would allow, it could be an area in which the U.S. in the future, not short term, but long term, could find a potential partner in both investment as well as development of human capital in the region, in the Middle East. But the differences, and these are crucial, are Israel-Palestine. Iran will not budge on this issue, and neither will the United States. Syria, they stand on opposite sides of what should happen in Syria and are actively involved on different ends. And Hezbollah in Lebanon. That is one issue that Iran will not budge on, and that is one issue that continues to be a thorn in the side of both Israel and the United States. And the next president needs to deal with the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is a Cold War that is doing a lot of damage in the Middle East region, and it is it's an issue that needs to be dealt with no matter who the next president is, and it's one that's going to be an extremely tough one because Saudi Arabia has been a very long-term ally of the United States, but opinions are turning in the U.S. about what our relationship should be with Saudi Arabia. And if Trump is the president, Congress has tried, even under Obama, but will definitely do so under President Trump, to bring legislation against the sanctions, to bring legislation against the Iran deal, and in a way to upend the Iran deal in any effective way. And that will probably work under President Trump. Under President Clinton, I think she would veto it, but that would be a large fight that would happen, especially, we have to see what happens in the congressional races as well. And that's sort of, the conclusion is they're going to have to deal with Iran, and it's a very tough one to deal with because there are, it's not just Iran, but it's also repercussions across the Middle East. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and this is another glistening facet in the jewel that is the Watson Institute, so I encourage you all to be aware of everything we're doing here and join in the learning that we're all doing every day in this building. It's especially an honor for me to be next to Rami Khouri. There are some people who still believe that journalists really don't have a role in commenting on world affairs. Anyone that knows this guy knows that's nonsense, so I love the fact that he has shown how insightful and trenchant journalists can be. So that's why I wanted to sit next to him. I certainly associate myself with the one word that I think was the essence of what Rami had to say, and that was no. That was his answer to the question, has the United States learned anything? No, I would agree with that. I would also agree that a good place to begin the era in which we now find ourselves in the Middle East is 1980. It's partly because of the beginning of our war in Afghanistan, but I think there was another interesting turning point that year. That was the year that the so-called Carter Doctrine emerged. That was the time when Jimmy Carter announced that the Persian Gulf was a vital security interest to the United States, and any other force that tried to penetrate into the Persian Gulf or the Persian Gulf region was treading on the vital interests of the United States. So that was a very important document, perhaps not fully understood in all of its implications at the time, that has played an important role in not only pulling us in, but keeping us in to the policing of that region. I want to pick up on one other thing that Rami said, and that was the suggestion that our intervention in the Middle East actually retards, in many cases, progress towards resolving conflicts there. It does seem that the more we do, the worse it gets. That's a great frustration for a nation that is activist by nature. We are compulsively activist. We want to do things. Americans don't like to understand things. We like to do things. So I see the opposites in this presidential campaign. We heard from one candidate, "What's Aleppo?" And we heard from another candidate, Hillary Clinton, "I will never forget the Libyan people." So one's deeply into it and concerned, the other has no idea. But the more I think about it, I begin to wonder, which is actually preferable? Maybe you'd rather have somebody that never heard of Aleppo and doesn't think he or she knows all the answers. Another great journalist, Robert Chaplin, who covered Vietnam for The New Yorker, had a great formulation. He said, "Whenever the American people get to know when is the rainy season in some foreign country, we're too deeply involved." So I begin to think that the depth of knowledge that you think you accumulate by years of sitting in the think tank, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative hothouse of Washington really doesn't help. It actually gives you this fantasy that you have ideas of how to resolve problems that actually have nothing to do with the reality on the ground. And I think Hillary Clinton's involvement in the Libya debacle is a great example of this. What if, when the idea came to overthrow Gaddafi by bombing Libya, had been presented to Secretary of State Clinton, and she said, "What's Libya? I'm not interested." Maybe Libya would be a much better place today, and she would not have had the chance to dance on Gaddafi's grave and say, "We came, we saw, he died," which is actually not the kind of language that I associate with a gifted diplomat, if I could differ from that characterization. President Obama announced early in his term that he wanted his foreign policy legacy to be a pivot toward Asia. He has been unable to achieve that. The reason is that when you pivot toward a place, you have to pivot away from another place. And he has not been able to pivot away from the Middle East. The quicksand of the Middle East has proven too deep and too potent to allow the strategic energy of the United States to be focused in an area where it really should be focused. I agree with his desire to do that, and I lament his inability. We can argue about why that happened, but it certainly has happened. It has not been possible for Obama to extricate himself and the United States from the Middle East to the degree that I think he might have wanted. So let me talk a little bit about how this confluence affects the presidential election. First of all, I think we can deal with the Israel-Palestine issue as it relates to this election quite easily. For Israel and Palestine, the election in the United States is over. Israel won. So it doesn't matter who comes out on top on election day. Israel is one certain winner. I think the next president, whoever it is going to be under intense pressure to escalate our involvement in Syria. But before we get to Syria, I think there are other more traditional issues that the next president is going to have to deal with. And I believe we're going to move, particularly under a Clinton presidency, closer back to the relationships with three important countries in that region as we have maintained them for years up until the Obama administration. And that is unconditional support for Israel, support for Saudi Arabia, and isolate Iran. Those have been three pillars of American policy toward the Middle East, away from which President Obama has gently sought to tiptoe. I think we'll be tiptoeing right back to where we were once the election is over. Trump's policy is quite perplexing to me. It depends on what day you tune in the TV. Everything he said that I like about world affairs, he himself has contradicted immediately thereafter, so I can't really judge what he might do. He has said some things that seem refreshingly realist. On the other hand, the people around him do not give you much hope that he will take a new approach to the Middle East. The figures around him are relatively limited when you talk about people of major national political standing, and all of them would certainly be in his administration. You'd have Newt Gingrich, and you'd have Chris Christie, and you'd have Rudy Giuliani. How about that for a Secretary of State? So the idea that you'd get kind of a refreshing new take on the Middle East, this seems a little bit to me like wishful thinking with Trump. In Syria, I think we face perhaps our most serious challenge because there is so much pressure for escalation. In the United States, we tend to increase our willingness to intervene militarily in a foreign conflict according to how bad the situation is on the ground. So if not so many people are being killed, maybe it doesn't seem so urgent. Then when it gets really awful, we feel the argument for intervention has increased. But that's really the wrong standard to use. The standard shouldn't be how bad is the humanitarian catastrophe. The standard should be, is there any prospect that our intervention might improve the situation? This is the question that we don't ask each other, and that's the reason why we plunge into situations based on emotion. And emotion is always the enemy of wise statesmanship. The need for escalation in Syria is almost an accepted principle now in the Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative think tank, media, hothouse that shapes our policy. It's an almost unanimous view that Obama didn't do enough and that we've been taken advantage of by other forces. But I see the situation a little bit differently. First of all, we've never managed to figure out who is really our enemy in Syria. We try to pretend that our enemy is ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but in fact, none of our allies, nobody who's on our side agrees with us on that. Everybody has their own enemy. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda and that spectrum of opinion is not the number one enemy of anybody in that region in our coalition, except possibly ourselves. But even we are fighting so many mini wars inside the great Syrian conflict that we've not been able to focus on the real enemy. Now, one reason there's so much pressure in Washington for intensified action in Syria is that our military is pushing for it. We had this most remarkable spectacle just within recent days of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sitting in front of a congressional committee and being asked the following question. President Obama wants to share intelligence with Russia so that we can target certain groups that we're both against together. What do you think about that? And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, we're not going to do that. I don't think I've ever heard the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff so explicitly reject a policy promoted by the commander-in-chief. And that shows you the intensity of feeling, particularly in the Pentagon, that an escalation in Syria is necessary. Why? Is it because people in the Pentagon are very concerned about Syria? No, I don't think so. I don't think they really care about Syria. It's all about Russia. Syria is just the theater. It gives us the chance to as soldiers in Afghanistan used to say, grease a few Ivans. Here's the chance for us to deal a bloody nose to Russia. That's why so many people in the Pentagon are so eager. And I think that spreads through the foreign policy establishment. The fact that Russia is involved there is a dramatic change, and that is something that is dragging the American political establishment towards the interventionist choice. What it tells me is that we need to reverse a policy that we have held since the very beginning of the Syrian war, which is that we do not talk to anybody on the other side. We will not talk to Russia, we will not talk to Syria, we will not talk to Hezbollah, we will not talk to Iran. We have very limited contact with them. And essentially what we've decided is that the horror of reaching an agreement that would accommodate the interests of Russia and the interests of Iran is so great that it outweighs the horror of the humanitarian catastrophe. It's better, as bad as it is, to see what's happening on the ground in Syria. It would be worse to reach a diplomatic agreement that would also accommodate the interests of Iran and Russia. Until we're able to get past that barrier, we're not going to have any calming of the war in Syria. And so far in the presidential campaign, there doesn't seem to be much interest in getting past it. Thank you.
Great. Terrific, and on time, all of you, wonderful. We have an hour exactly for discussion, which is what we planned. I will be keeping a list of people who want to speak. I already saw one hand in the audience, a person who knows as much, if not more than most of us about this issue, Ambassador Chas Freeman, and then anybody else who wants to speak, including people on Twitter. I'll point to you after. Please try to be brief. It doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment, but just try to be brief.
I will try to be very brief. I have an anecdote to relate since you mentioned OFAC. And I have a question to ask you, Narges, and also Rami Khouri, about coercive diplomacy as it affected the deal with Iran and might affect future deals elsewhere. The anecdote is this, that in 1971, when President Nixon was trying to open the door to China, his National Security Council staff were unable, wait.
No, please, because it's being recorded, so it's important to speak into the microphone.
Yeah. In 1971, no sound.
I'm so sorry about that.
In 1971, when Nixon was trying to open to China, he issued a policy statement which said that there were going to be relaxations of OFAC controls on transactions with China, and nothing happened. And the National Security Council staff asked me, on the China desk at the State Department, to try to get Treasury to comply. And so I took the head of OFAC to lunch. And after a very nice lunch, at the right moment, I handed him the presidential policy statement. And he read it, and I said to him, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, that's the president's policy, it's not Treasury's. And we have a lot of that going on now. The question is this. There is now a pretty well-established narrative, you referred to it, Narges, that sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table. And you said you can argue the other side. Many people do argue the other side, that in fact it was the United States that wouldn't go to the bargaining table, not Iran, and that the United States in fact rejected several deals that Iran offered and ended up with a worse deal than it could have had from the Brazilian-Turkish negotiation, for example. So you said you could argue one way or the other. I'd like to know which way you argue. And also I'd like Rami to comment on, since you also raised sanctions and coercive diplomacy, on the utility of this in the Middle East and elsewhere.
So we're going to take two more questions before, so we can give people a chance.
Thank you for an amazing conversation. It's rare to have such a diversity of views, and it's even rare to hear Mr. Kinzer not mentioning Turkey once in the course of the conversation. I'm Turkish, so I'll be slightly biased in saying this. In the last presidential debate, President Clinton said her endgame in Syria will be to intensify airstrikes on ISIS and to work with Arab and Kurdish partners to retake Raqqa. Something we're almost certain is going to happen before November 8 will be the retaking of Mosul, at least an attempt. And that cannot happen on Arab and Kurdish forces alone, because there seems to be a three-way duel going on around Mosul. Turks have 3,000 people north of Mosul that they've been training for over 2 years. Kurds have stepped up their insurgency in Iran, so it's highly unlikely that the Shiites will be allowing that to happen. And the Kurds, although they're a commendable fighting force, they want U.S. support for a contiguous enclave in northern Syria. Without that, they will not be moving a finger. So the chances are, by the time on day one of a Clinton or Trump presidency, and God knows what President Trump is going to do, there will be a major problem, a major quagmire in Syria. If Syria goes even further into crisis, into stalemate, what are the chances of any American president being able to do anything other than trying to preserve the status quo, possibly to no avail? Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'd also like to thank all the panelists first for a very sophisticated discussion. I have a question for Mr. Khouri specifically. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in political science, and I've spent the last year in Tunisia and the previous 2 summers in the marginalized areas where the Arab Spring began. And I found your analysis very compelling, especially the idea that this policy has 35 years of piling up behind it. But what I've noticed is it seems that the U.S.'s reputation is now so bad, particularly among youth, that no matter what the policy is, they're going to assume the U.S. is against them. So 2 quick examples. When the coup in Egypt happened, those who were supporting the Tamarrud movement thought that it was necessary because the U.S. had put the Muslim Brotherhood in power, whereas those who were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood said that the U.S. had actually orchestrated the coup. 2 conflicting ideas. Of people who were commenting on the ISIS invasion of Mosul, people were either supporting ISIS and saying it was necessary to prevent U.S. aggression in the region, or they said that ISIS itself was a U.S. creation and that the U.S. was responsible for the movement. So what I wonder is, even if the U.S. did change its policy, would we see a response to that on the street, or has the U.S. poisoned the well so much that at this point it's going to take a generation, if not more? Thank you.
Please.
So I'll respond to thank you for the anecdote and the question about OFAC and the sanctions bring Iran to the table. So how many people here know what OFAC is? Okay, so just to let you all know, OFAC stands for Office of Foreign Assets Control, and it's within the Department of Treasury. It's basically one of the main functions of OFAC is to deal with the sanctions that the United States puts on other countries. So before it was countries like Iraq and Cuba, Syria today, Russia to some extent also, and then Iran. OFAC is very, very stringent on the way that it interprets the policies of sanctions. Just like our audience member just spoke about, President Obama has a certain policy that he wants implemented with Iran, and the Iran nuclear deal that all the sides signed has steps that when Iran fulfills certain things, shows the nuclear sites, gets the centrifuge count down X, Y, and Z, then the international community, the EU, and the U.S. will respond by lifting sanctions. And it goes step by step into how that will happen. OFAC has been extremely slow in doing this, and not only has it been slow, but more to the point is that it has worked obstructively against the EU and has said that if EU countries and EU companies start doing business with Iran, which is now legally allowed under the Iran nuclear deal, then the US OFAC and Department of Treasury will then sanction those European companies. So what that's doing is, in effect, it's saying that basically what we signed has we can't go by what we signed. And that's what's turning the Iran deal in Iran into such a difficult thing for the Rouhani administration to continue to stand by it. But to get to your question about did the sanctions bring, my opinion is that the sanctions did not bring Iran to the table. Iran has been for more than a decade sending signals to the United States that it wants to sit down and negotiate. And repetitively, the U.S. has turned down those requests. So I don't think that happened. I think more than anything, Obama wanted to start to open up to Iran again. It was part of his foreign policy that he wanted to do that. And I think the United States also, because of everything that was described on this panel, realized that it needed to begin to open up conversations with Iran again, because there are very few allies that it feels like it can speak to, and there are so many issues going on in the Middle East. So it needed Iran, and that's what happened, in my opinion.
Let me just make two comments in response to two of the questions. First of all, on OFAC, we are not now in our relationship with Iran where I would have predicted we would be when the agreement was signed. And I think why it hasn't gone as well, number one reason is OFAC. The reason I miscalculated is I didn't realize that the United States would be so active in preventing the normalization of economic relations with Iran. I assumed, perhaps foolishly, that the Treasury Department was still subject to the authority of the White House, and that once there was a deal signed, OFAC would go along. That didn't happen, so that was my miscalculation because I hadn't been along on that lunch in 1971.
Can I just mention one thing really quickly? For OFAC, for example, just really quickly, I mean, even when I wanted to do research in Iran, it delayed my research for 9 months. Because, I mean, it delays social scientific research in the country because it says that could be in violation of sanctions. And so, that's on the research level, let alone, and OFAC comes after researchers. So it's definitely going after big companies. So anyway, just to kind of put it in context.
Now I have to add a story. I was in Iraq when Iraq was under sanctions, and I met the head of the UN office in Baghdad, and he held up a lead pencil to me, and he said, I am not allowed to import pencils into Iraq because the U.S. Treasury Department tells me that the lead in the pencils could be repurposed and then it could be put into a powder, it could be put on the front of an airplane, and that would render the airplane invisible to radar. And he said, I'm not an aeronautics expert, but I wish I could bring some pencils into Iraq for school children. That's the extent to which it goes. And I can tell you this one other story. I went to visit my own congressman in Washington not so long ago to talk. It was during when the Iran deal was being negotiated, and he was against it. I was trying to persuade him, and he made this point. It was all the sanctions. We did it with the sanctions, and that's what brought them to the table. And I offered a counter argument. He was very taken aback, and the next day I got a message saying, there will be no more meetings between you and the congressman. Let me answer one other question that was about Syria and the chances for peace. I believe the chances for peace are no greater with a new administration than they are now. They may be even harder until or unless we get to the point where we're willing to broaden our circle of diplomatic contacts. We have to, in order to resolve this conflict, take into account the strategic interests of other parties. So that requires us to make a few decisions, a few statements, a few commitments, a few understandings. We have to believe that neither Russia nor Iran poses a true strategic threat to the United States. That if their strategic power is confirmed, it does not affect our vital interests. And in fact, we have some common interests with Iran and Russia. We are not at the point of being able to make any of those statements now, and until we get there, I don't see any escape from the current Syrian conundrum.
Thank you for the questions. For the coercive diplomacy utility question, I think it really goes back to the question of legitimacy. I think if coercive diplomacy is used in a legitimate international context, for instance, something sanctioned by the UN Security Council, then it could be possibly useful because you'd have the whole world possibly agreeing to it in some cases. the way the U.S. has used it has, I think, not been very effective. And it's not because of the mechanics of the coercion, it's because of the significant presumptive and arrogant sense among the American political establishment as a whole that the United States sets the rules for the world. That the U.S. decides how things are done, and if you comply, then you're our friend and we'll help you, and if you don't comply, we're going to pressure you, we're going to attack you, we're going to sanction you, we're going to bomb you, we're going to make life difficult for you. This is one of the biggest underlying problems in American foreign policy, the presumption of superiority in both morality and policy. And this went on for years and years in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then finally people caught on to it about 20, 30 years ago, and especially after the Cold War ended, I think people started judging the United States less on its rhetoric and more on its actual policies. And in that sense, I think American coercive diplomacy has not been very effective. In fact, it probably triggers a reverse reaction, that when the U.S. starts to pressure somebody, whether it's Hezbollah or Iran or somebody else, that tends to cause that party to fight back more vigorously and generates greater public opinion support for them. So the answer, I think, is that if the U.S. decides that somebody in the world is doing something bad, they should take that case to a legitimate forum of action, like, say, the UN Security Council, rather than, say, the U.S. Senate. The problem with the policy, the issue of how people respond to the U.S.'s actual words or policies or intentions or feelings or whatever, is that the United States' actions, actual actions on the ground across most of the Middle East for most of the last half century have hurt ordinary people. That's the problem. So whatever the U.S. says, for instance, Obama went to Cairo 5 years ago and made a very, very powerful speech, and it was very well received. But then U.S. policy countered that by supporting Arab autocrats, leaning to the Israelis, using military action, et cetera, et cetera. The Iran deal was a major change in American policy. I was fully supportive of the Iran negotiations, and the Iran negotiations were at the same time very American and very un-American. They were very American in the sense that it was a situation where the United States basically said, there is a rule of law, which is the IAEA regulations, which allows people to have nuclear stuff for peaceful purposes. And the U.S. said, well, we want to play by the rules, and Iran should have this, fine, we'll negotiate. They also are very American in the sense that the U.S. said, well, we need to be even-handed. The Iranians have certain legitimate demands. We have certain legitimate demands. They have concerns. We have concerns. Let's sit and talk them through and discuss them and negotiate them and find an agreement that fits everybody. That's a very American way of doing it. It's like, how do you solve a baseball strike, a baseball player strike? You negotiate, you talk to the, and then you come up with a solution. But it was very un-American in the sense that America's foreign policy has rarely used this approach. Almost never has the United States used this approach in addressing issues that it was involved in, or issues that it was not itself directly involved in, like, for instance, the Arab-Israeli conflict, where the United States has squarely been on the side of Israel, even though it's had 20 years of diplomatic mediation, a monopoly on diplomatic mediation, and applying the Henry Kissinger and Dennis Ross school of diplomacy has been a total, utter serial failure, because it was not even-handed. If the United States applies the principles of the Iran negotiations to the Arab-Israeli conflict, like what happened, for instance, in Northern Ireland, where the U.S. was also involved, then there would be great breakthroughs in the Arab-Israeli peacemaking process. But that's not the case. So the people judge the U.S. by what it actually does. If the United States comes out tomorrow and says, look, we need to make sure that countries remain relatively stable, that they don't collapse, that oil flows don't stop from around the region, that terrorism doesn't expand. Those are understandable things that everybody can understand. But if the U.S. were then to say, we're going to create a fund with our allies around the world of $50 billion to support Arab governments that promote freedom of expression and an independent judiciary and water environmental protection policies. And any Arab government that does this based on, say, UN monitoring, not US monitoring, they can draw on this $50 billion and help their people. So if the US were to take a positive policy that focuses on and responds to and acknowledges the rights and aspirations of ordinary people rather than the power elite that's hanging around the ruling family and making tons of money by being part in a corrupt rentier political economy, then the people would respond positively to the U.S. Absolutely. People respond positively to countries that deal with them as decent human beings. But the fundamental issues that matter to the 400 million Arabs I mentioned, the most fundamental issues that are all across the board, that have been clearly expressed by people in so many forms in the Arab world in the last, say, 25 years, including public opinion and uprisings and votes and this and that. Every one of those issues has not been touched by American foreign policy. Legitimacy, justice, equity, environmental protection, sustained economic and equitable growth, rule of law, human rights protections, Arab-Israeli peacemaking that's equal to both sides, and the accountability of governments, human rights protections, national integrity. Every single one of these issues that matters to ordinary people has not ever been touched by American policy. Rhetoric is all over the place. You can find every week the U.S. puts out a statement about the rule of law and democracy and human rights, but actual policy has made these issues much worse for most ordinary people around the region, and that's why they react negatively to the U.S.
If I may, oh, sorry.
Could I just add to this
Yeah.
question as well? I think, I mean, it's a very good point that the U.S. has, in some ways, put itself in a position where it can't win, right? It will get blamed and it will get negative public opinion no matter what it does. And I think it's worth remembering that in 2011, when Gaddafi's forces were moving on Benghazi and it looked like it was going to be a slaughter, the Arab League actually voted in favor of Western intervention, right? And then the moment NATO forces did so, the Arab League said, "Oh, we didn't mean that. That's not what we meant," right? It's absurd to think that that's not what they meant, right? There's no way that they were going to stop Gaddafi with flowers. So there had to be some sort of force used. And I think that you have to look at sort of the underlying issue that we are now in this position where we can't win, but the reason that happens is that America is so powerful, so militarily strong, that when we make mistakes in the Middle East, it's not measured in weeks or months or years. It's measured in generations, right? And we made a huge mistake in 2003, and we're going to be paying for it for a really long time.
Beshara, just one quick 30-second. Another important thing, every action the United States takes in the Middle East, in the Arab world, is going to be measured against its behavior in the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict is the litmus test of law, morality, and decency in the eyes of ordinary Arab people. So if the United States acts on the Arab-Israeli front to achieve peace and rights for both Israelis and Palestinians and Lebanese and everybody else and Syrians, ending occupation, et cetera, if the United States acts on that front constructively and equitably, it will have massive support in the Arab countries. But it remains the litmus test because everything the United States does, ordinary people in the Arab world, I hear this every day. They say, what do you mean you want to promote human rights in Morocco and women's rights in Morocco? What about the rights of Palestinian women? What about the rights of people in occupied Golan? It is the litmus test. People in this country may not like it, but it is the reality. And what the U.S. showed is that it can come to grips with the reality in Iran, and we hope it will do so in the Arab-Israeli conflict.
And I think if I could just add one footnote to that, what you're saying is a little bit contradicting of what Jeff said. What you're saying is we can win. It's not that we can't win. If we have different policies, I think we can win.
So I see a hand, but I would like to ask a question. it takes a lot of effort and persistence to make mistakes continuously in the same way for 35 or more years. So obviously, it's not a mistake. I think that attitude that position that somehow it's all been a big mistake and people are not learning and they're not stupid. So these policies are there for a reason. What are those reasons? You made a long list of all the wonderful things any country should do to help a region in trouble. But I don't know of any great power or empire that ever cared about any of these things when it dealt with the rest of the world. Why should the United States be any different? So that's one issue. The other issue is we keep saying the United States, but obviously there's a lot of conflicts and different actors. The Treasury Department and the President is just one example. So there are conflicting forces. It's not a monolith. So who are these forces that have been so successful at, despite all these terrible mistakes and counterproductive and blowback and et cetera? The whole world sees it as a failed policy in some respects compared to the rhetoric of what this policy is supposed to accomplish. Who are these people who are so successful at making sure these policies continue, despite obvious knowledge that they are counterproductive to the people of the region? So, I mean, I think it would be interesting for me to hear why this is happening, beyond the double standard issue, which is easy to accuse any great power of. Most great powers say one thing and do another. But beyond that, what are those fundamental interests that will continue this policy as it was before? And then we have Elias and two right there, okay.
So Elias Mahenna from the Department of Comparative Literature and the faculty fellow here at the Watson. I have a very specific question. If you had the ear of the next president and you could dictate, you could play the role of Kissinger, you could essentially create a policy not to roll back the failures of American foreign policy in the region for the past 35 years, not to remake a generation, not to solve all of these intractable systemic and structural issues, but to just put an end to the war in Syria. What would be your recommendation?
Barbara, next to you. Oh, yeah, got it. Okay.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a sophomore here in the undergrad. I was just curious, so a lot of talk has been that we need to compromise and negotiate with with Russia, Iran, regardless who it is. But my question is, how can we negotiate with, like we've tried to negotiate with Russia when we're not really, it's been difficult to trust the actions that they've taken. Like, how can we act in good faith with, how can we get over the hurdle, Mr. Kinzer, you were talking about, of like willing to compromise than what's worse on the ground situation? Like, how can we trust Russia, Iran, Turkey, Syria to act in good faith with the agreements that we put together?
One more.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. One short question. What I see from your presentation is that the real problem here is not...
Turn the mic towards you. There you go.
Like that, yeah? Okay, like the real problem here is not just the next president, but one of like underlying policy ideas about, you know, the US in the Middle East. And those ideas, they're made in Washington, like in the think tank Washington Circle. So my question is, how can we change those ideas? How can we, you know, get into this, you know, the think tank elite in Washington to make a difference actually about how the US thinks about the Middle East and what it can do and what it can't do?
Thank you. I think we'll take some answers, but let me just add here that one of the major developments in policy making in this country has been the decentering of universities and actually cutting them out of the discussion for the most part, and replacing those university experts with a mushrooming of special interest think tanks that started in the 60s but have really become very, very powerful in the 80s and the 90s. And they constitute a revolving door. So the head of the think tank then becomes responsible for the policy and then comes back to the think tank and so on. Possibly the most successful example of that is WINEP, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is an arm of AIPAC, which is a pro-Israel lobby, and the heads of WINEP become the advisors on Middle East policy for presidents, and they can come back with it. It's kind of a revolving door. And so the bigger question here for some of us academics is, does it matter at all what we do or say? So here we go.
Well, should I start?
Please.
Very good questions. The first one to Beshara, you said that these are not mistakes. I think it's right. These are not mistakes. This is American policy. And the U.S. has consistently done this with a relatively strong majority in the Congress and the political elite in Washington. So this is not a mistake. The policies have been ineffective, I would argue, and counterproductive in many respects. And we see the problems that are emerging out of the Middle East today that are hurting the Middle East, first of all, especially Syria and Iraq and Yemen and other places. The Palestinians have been hurt for 70 years almost. I would argue the Israelis are morally hurt by what they're doing to the Palestinians. And I would argue that the threats coming out of Israel and Palestine and the rest of the Middle East are now spreading around the world in refugees, terrorism, disruptive movements of people, etc., which have created counter forces of xenophobia, Islamophobia, etc., in Europe, the U.S. and other places. So a lot of things have happened that come out of the Middle East that are problematic for a lot of people. But the U.S. has consistently stuck to this policy with very, very few exceptions. I think once Reagan held up AWACS sale, and somebody held up loan guarantees. Bush, I think, held up loan guarantees to Israel, and the going against the Israel lobby and Israel's Netanyahu's desires on the Iran issue were exceptions to this situation. And the U.S. opposing the Saudi opposition to the Iran was an exception. But by and large, this consistent policy in the United States to the Middle East and these broad terms has persisted simply because it doesn't make much difference to the United States. In the eyes of the United States, the Middle East has had historically 3 or 4 important issues: oil and energy, the security of Israel, confronting the Soviets in the Cold War, and more recently, fighting terrorism and radicalism. Those 4 big issues historically defined how the United States carried out policy. They talked about democracy and promoting economic development, but they weren't very serious about that. But where they were serious was following steps to ensure those 4 policies were achieved. And by and large, they were achieved. So Israel has been safe and now is very powerful. Oil continues to flow despite some wars here and there. The Cold War finished, the Soviets lost. And so the United States broadly, I think, has felt that the negative impact of its policies are tangential to the core body of what it does. I think that changed, though, in the last 10 years. I think what we're seeing now is that the negative consequences of the policies of many countries in the Middle East are creating problems and threats to people all over the world, including in the United States. The second thing that's happening is that inside the United States, we have started to see, about 5 years ago, and now it is moving very quickly, a clear division between the policy elite that is focused essentially in the White House, in Congress, and in the think tanks, and a little bit in the media in Washington and the eastern United States, a few cities basically, where the policy has maintained these views, whereas in the rest of the country, opinions have evolved to a much more even-handed position, especially on issues like Iran, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, like America's getting involved in military wars. On those key issues, the public opinion in the U.S., including among Jewish Americans, has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years or so, and now we consistently see in mainstream churches, in educational campuses, in professional scholarly associations, among some labor unions, in many dimensions of American life, as well as in the country as a whole, when polling is done, you see much more even-handed positions among Americans for Arabs and Israelis to negotiate with Iran, not to support dictatorships and police states only. The American people are decent people. The American political system is not a decent system in its Middle East policies. It's a vulgar system, and it has produced vulgar, dangerous results. And American ordinary people are starting to understand this, especially after 16 years of fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, which have only created ISIS, a bigger Qaeda, and a resurgent Taliban, and terrorism threats in California and Florida and New York and everywhere else. So ordinary Americans understand this. Politicians in Washington don't understand this. Their value system is purely to be reelected. And the pressures on them from many different groups inside the country and outside the country keep them following these policy lines, because that's how they get reelected. And they don't particularly care about anything else, neither morality, nor international law, nor anything else, even-handedness. And this is a problem that the American people have to resolve if they want their political system to do this. It doesn't do this on anything else in the world. Only on issues, for instance, of supporting Israel in its war on Gaza do you get a 100-0 vote. It's incredible in the Senate. So there is a structural problem, and it's not just the pro-Israeli positions. You get other lobbies, other special interest groups that act on the political class. So there's a serious dysfunctional divide now between the political elite in Washington and the rest of the country, and you're seeing it in the massive rejection among the American people, not total rejection, but huge hesitance among American public to both Trump and Clinton. They dislike both of them. Well, they have to vote for somebody, but they don't like the two choices that the system has given them. The issue of Syria, Syria is I think Stephen said, Syria is just a symptom. The bigger issue is Russia, and the bigger issue, which the U.S. has to get come to terms with, is that the Middle East now is not just a superpower confrontation arena, it's also an arena where regional powers have started to take the lead. Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and sometimes Israel. Israel has pretty much stayed out of most of the current things going on. Occasionally they do things behind the scenes, but Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are now big drivers of events in the region and of the military fighting. The United States has to come to terms with that and has to basically, for Syria, the only thing that can be achieved now in Syria is to get a permanent ceasefire, accept the informal division of the country as it is right now, temporarily, and then fight against ISIS, get rid of ISIS, which is the threat that everybody faces, and then figure out, according to what the Syrian people want, figure out how do we deal with the rest of the opposition forces and the Syrian government who continue to confront themselves. It's telling that the most effective rebels in Syria, other than ISIS, which are not, I don't consider them like a rebel group, but the other groups that have been fighting, Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham and the hundreds and hundreds of other small groups, the most effective ones have an Islamist veneer to them. And this is something the United States has to figure out how to come to terms with. The mainstream secular nationalist tribal opposition has been ineffective. All the other attempts to create a national coalition of opposition have been ineffective. But the most effective forces on the ground are ones that have some kind of Islamist veneer to them. And this raises serious questions about what do we do. I think the United States should look at Syria like it looked at Vietnam. You know, the United States lost in Vietnam. And today Vietnam's, hunky-dory. We get to buy cheap sneakers and we get to buy electronics, and they're our friends and they're lovely people. And it took, because the Vietnamese were left to their own devices to run their own country. The Syrians have to determine what happens in Syria. It's not going to be the Americans or the Russians. The problem also is that the Russians are prepared to play hardball, and the Americans are playing wiffle ball. And it's not that you can't play hardball on one side and wiffle ball on the other side. You can't have any kind of normal interactions. The Russians are doing things, and they're setting the agenda. The majority of Syrians don't want to live under Russian control. They don't want to live under Assad, but they don't want to live under Islamists either. But they don't have any choice. So right now, the Syrian people don't have a say in what's going on, unfortunately. But the final, ultimate shape of a resolution of the war in Syria will have to be decided by the Syrian people. And the last point about the Washington think tank elite, I mentioned a little bit about it before, that the think tank elite and the government, I think as Beshara said, are essentially one group of people. The debate on Syria in the United States today, I just wrote a column on this, you can find it on my website, ramikhouri.com. The debate on Syria in the United States today that I followed for the last month here in the United States is like fantasy football. It's people passionately making statements about we have to stop the suffering, we have to help the people, we have to do something. But it's like fantasy football that you can choose your partners, you can change your players, you can change your strategy, you can do whatever you want, and you feel strongly about it, and you get in there and you do it, and then it doesn't make any difference because it's totally detached from reality on the ground. So the debate about Syria in the United States has been, I think, infantile and quite totally irrelevant to what's going on in the region, while the United States is actively involved in helping fuel the fighting, as are the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians and the Saudis and Hezbollah and everybody else. So the United States, I think, has to get out of it, this sort of dream world that it lives in the Middle East. And people are saying the United States needs to take action now, military action, to stop the suffering of the Syrian people. Well, my response to that is the United States has been taking military action for 35 years, and it has brought us to this situation with the military action of all the other people. And the last thing we need is more American militarism.
Let me just make a couple of very short comments. So what factors might be driving this, our foreign policy? I think other than Israel, we've got some very important interests that we're pursuing. Number one, we want to confront the Soviet Union. Number two, we need the vital oil supplies from Saudi Arabia that are essential to our economy. And number three, we want to be sure to stop anybody who's weakening the Shah of Iran or trying to pull Iran out of our orbit. Our foreign policy doesn't change when the world changes. We are not agile, and that's always a bad sign for empires. And just briefly on the question of how the Syrian war ends, or the Syrian wars end, without going through all the different options, I think one of the obstacles that we have in the United States is psychological. We want primacy. We want full spectrum dominance. We do not want to take into account the interests of other countries. We're not used to that. It's not in our national DNA. We're used to winning. And diplomatic negotiation, by definition, is always a compromise. So just because we are not able to reach a diplomatic solution at this moment does not mean that the alternative is there must be a military solution. We forgot how wars end. Now, most wars don't end with a great victory by one side and a big parade. They end with a compromise in which the interests of various parties are taken into account. And that's something that we have to grasp if we want to become a positive promoter and help end the war in Syria.
I would just say that in response to Beshara's question about are these mistakes, I mean, I don't think these are mistakes. I mean, I think this is American empire. But I want to agree with the two previous speakers in that U.S. policy towards the Middle East, for the most part, has been defined by oil, terrorism, and support of Israel. What happened, though, is that it went from containment to direct intervention. So post 9/11, we went from a policy of containing states and different forces in the Middle East to direct intervention. And that's what we're seeing the consequences of today. But to your question about, if these continue to hurt the people in the Middle East, why are these policies continued? Because I actually don't think the people of the Middle East are important to Washington politicians, or to conceptions of our policies in the Middle East. It's not about people. It's about geopolitics. It's about oil. It's about sort of the realpolitik of the region. And it's not, this is not just the case in the Middle East. I think this is the way in which U.S. foreign policy or any sort of empire looks at its foreign policy. And so this is sort of where I see it going, and why do we sort of continue this? I would say follow the money. And I think the previous two speakers have spoken about how the money really affects think tanks and the ways in which these policies get continued.
So 3 quick points. One is this about mistakes? And I think most of the views here is that that this hasn't been about mistakes. And on a certain long-term principles, sure, oil, Israel, fighting terrorism, that's true. But to look back at the 2003 Iraq War and not declare it as a mistake seems remarkable to me, that no one else is picked up on the idea that we made a huge mistake, and most of even the Washington foreign policy elite looks back and realizes that that was a mistake. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about when America makes a mistake, it lasts for generations. That's going to be a real problem. Second point was just on can the U.S. win Arab public opinion, and I think you're right that there was some tension between what we were saying. Sure, if there's a massive shift in American position on Israel, we could win the Arab Street. But as Stephen points out, the election is over in some sense on Israel. Israel's already won. And so I don't think there's actually much tension if you take as an assumption that the U.S. position on Israel is not going to change significantly with either of these two candidates. But the last thing, the third thing I wanted to pick up on was the question that Stephen asked earlier in his usual provocative and somewhat tongue-in-cheek way, which is ignorance really so bad, right? Like, what's a Libya, right? What's Aleppo? Is that really so bad? And, he phrased this question in a way that makes it lighthearted, but in this election, I think we have to take that question seriously. Is ignorance so bad? And sure, I'm a university professor by trade. My answer to this question is almost foreordained, right? I'm not going to take a pro-ignorance perspective on things. But that's the real question here. Is ignorance so bad? And I think to sort of sweep this under the carpet, rather, is to really misunderstand the president's role in foreign policy, which I view as very much like a goalkeeper in soccer or hockey, which is to not screw up. Right? To not make huge mistakes, and to make sure that when you have Treasury doing one thing and DOD doing another thing, that there's some sort of coherent vision. And of course, that can only be on the largest and most important issues. But when we get a presidential mistake, it echoes, sort of reverberates around the world. And so that's why I think we have to take this question really seriously in this election.
Okay, we have 1, 2, and I think that'll be the last 2 questions. You've been wonderful so far. I mean, it's unbelievable. So, please. Go ahead and talk. Yeah, but I'm going to give you this.
Thanks. So I have
Yep.
Here we go. So I have a question in response to something that Professor Khouri said a little while ago, which was that everything that we do in the Middle East is going to be dictated by how we approach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So my question is, if you look at how the dynamics of that conflict have shifted since Oslo and since Camp David, Israel doesn't fear Syria and Egypt anymore. Israel fears non-state actors, Hezbollah, by extension Iran, fears whatever's going on in Gaza. If you take all of that into account, how does the United States even proceed with trying to mediate? Who do we even invite to the table? And then what do we do once those actors get there?
I was going to answer your question. Just very briefly. I think Keynes said that most of us are prisoners of some dead economist's ideology or thought. And I think our foreign policy establishment is the prisoner of dead university professors whose jobs were paid for by the military-industrial complex. Huge quantities of money from the Defense Department through the National Defense Education Act and so forth, all of it focused on how to coerce foreigners, none of it on how to take into account their views or persuade them. I think we have a national security ideology which constitutes the equivalent of a deep state. It doesn't go away. I do have a question. I count 12, 13, maybe 14 different wars going on in Syria. There's a war between the Assad government and Daesh, the caliphate. There's a war with the Kurds. There's a war between Assad and US-aided and Saudi-aided and other people's guerrillas. There's the US versus Russia. There's the US versus Daesh directly. The US versus Assad. There's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia versus Assad. The Saudis versus Hezbollah. There is Iraq, apparently, Shiite militias, now in Aleppo, serving with the Assad regime, attacking whoever it is, Jabhat al-Nusra, or whatever they call themselves this week. And Turkey against the Kurds, also against Daesh, and against Russia on occasion. Hezbollah fighting Sunnis, and Iran fighting Daesh and anyone else who gets in the way. This is a lot of different wars. Which one is the key one? Where do you start pulling if you want to stop all this?
But let's keep our answers brief because
Okay.
9 more minutes before our official close.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaz. The list I've used had 12. Now you've got it up to 15, so I'm continuously learning from you. Thank you for that. The answer, I think, if there's one war that we have to resolve, it's the war that has been continuously fought all across the Middle East by those who would allow the people of those countries, and the Arab world in particular, would allow the people of those countries to define themselves and their values and their policies, and those who would insist on the policies and values and structures of a country being designed by somebody from the outside. In other words, the rights, the consent of the governed versus autocratic police state and imperially dictated policies. That's the one war, if we had to find a common denominator, that's the one I would find. And it started, the Syria situation started by ordinary Syrians demanding this in Dira in March, April 2011, asking for reform and then change of the regime. And this is what the Arab uprisings were all about. The question on the Arab-Israeli situation, how should the U.S. proceed? Well, at a logistical level, I would say it should proceed like it proceeded in Iran and in Northern Ireland. There's two precedents that the U.S. was directly involved in, where it helped or was involved in resolving what had been quite intractable conflicts, and they were resolved peacefully to the benefit of everybody equally. And this is a great achievement of American foreign policy, and we have to tip our cap to the U.S. for doing this, which shows that it can do it. There's nothing in the water or in the chromosomes of the United States that prevents it from acting rationally and equitably and forcefully according to the rule of law. So they've done it. So they should take those two precedents and learn from them and figure out what to do. The second point is to learn from the past experience. You mentioned that after 9/11, or after 2000, after Oslo, you mentioned things started to change, and now we've got Hezbollah and Hamas. Actually, Hezbollah and Hamas came about in the early 1980s, a decade before Oslo. And why did they come about? They came about predominantly as a reaction to the long-term Israeli occupation and colonization. And Iran and Israel were great buddies under the Shah. Iran was giving them oil and security and all kinds of stuff and help with the Kurds and whatever. So the reality is that Hezbollah and Hamas came about as a consequence of lack of equitable American or foreign involvement in the Arab-Israeli peacemaking equation. And the answer is to engage everybody according to the accepted international rule of law, which we have in UN resolutions, conventions, and many other things.
I would just point out one interesting fact. So the American lead negotiator in the Northern Ireland peace process was former Senator George Mitchell. Later on, George Mitchell was named to be the U.S. mediator in the Israel-Palestine question, and he quit after about 6 months. Kofi Annan also quit after being asked to negotiate a settlement to the Syria war right at the beginning because the United States wouldn't come into the room with the other parties. So I think it's easier to resolve problems anywhere else in the world than it is to resolve one that has to do with Israel because of the way the American political system has been configured to respond so instinctively to everything that Israel asks.
Narges? Good?
I mean, so the question that you asked about which war is an unbelievably difficult question, so I don't think there's a particularly good answer. But I very much agree with Rami's principle that, whatever happens there has to be resolved according to the consent of those who are in the region. And so on some level, I think that the U.S., for U.S. audiences, the one war should be with Daesh. Try to resolve that and get out. And that's not a happy answer by any means because it means leaving a lot of mess there. But if I could shut down one thing, that's the one I would try to go.
Well, what we do is we wring our hands while sitting on them on humanitarian issues, and then we shove more weapons in and decry the slaughter. It really is an appalling, self-contradictory approach.
Well, we may look back at these days and say, we wish the United States would remain strong, because I think it's one thing for a strong actor to create a big mess and then find itself not being the strong actor anymore, and even if it found its conscience or some sort of a will to do things differently, no longer has the power to do it, which I think is what we're looking at for the next 20, 30 years. The United States is becoming a more and more marginal actor in what actually happens in the Middle East, having, of course, unleashed a number of forces that can no longer control. And that, for a historian, of course, is not a new story. When you try to, I think one of the things we'll probably need to do in the future is think about what does the next 50 years from now look like as opposed to the immediate geopolitics of the moment, because the kinds of challenges that are coming about are not one that the United States can even dream about dealing with or having a policy about by itself. And so we'll just have to pay more attention to the Middle East, because it'll count more and more in terms of how the future of that region is shaped. And that means you should all take Middle East Studies courses that come to our events. Okay. Thank you very much.